Good evening and welcome to Reproaction's final Act and Learn webinar of 2016. Our topic tonight is When Democrats Hold Power, Lessons for Reproductive Justice Activists from the Obama Years. We're so excited you've joined us. Thank you. So first we'll introduce your host. My name is Erin Masson and I'm based in Arlington, Virginia, right outside of Washington, D.C., and I'm one of the co-founders and co-directors of Reproaction.
And I am the other co-founder and co-director of Reproaction. My name is Pamela Merritt, and I am based in St. Louis, Missouri.
Great. So just a quick tick through the agenda. This is going to be a free-flowing discussion tonight, not much in the way of presentation. We'll introduce Reproaction, our organization. Then we'll have a panel discussion featuring Jodi Jacobson, the president and editor-in-chief of Rewire. We'll go through next steps, and then we'll do a Q&A with Jodi and Reproaction co-directors. If you have questions, feel free to type them in at any point during the presentation in the chat box, and we'll get to as many of them as possible at the end. So with that, I'll introduce Reproaction. Reproaction is a new direct action group that formed to increase access to abortion and advance reproductive justice. We're incredibly proud of our left flank analysis and our willingness to hold folks on all sides accountable to increasing access to abortion and advancing reproductive justice, whether they're traditionally thought of as allies or oppositions. We hold a deep commitment to nonviolent direct action, and it is one of the tactics in our toolbox. And with that, I'll pass it to Pamela to introduce Jodi.
Thank you so much, Erin. So I'm proud and thrilled to introduce Jodi Jacobson, who is the president and editor-in-chief of Rewire. Jodi is a longtime leader in the health and development community and an advocate with extensive experience in public health, gender equity, human rights, environmental and demographic issues. Jodi was the director of advocacy at American Jewish World Service and the founder and executive director of the Center for Health and Gender Equity, otherwise known as Change, an organization that monitors and seeks to promote accountability of U.S. international policy to women's reproductive and sexual health and rights. Thank you so much for joining us, Jodi.
Oh my gosh, thank you for having me. I'm so delighted to be here, and as I hope you both know, biggest fans. Because you're biggest fan. You're a biggest fan.
Oh, thank you so much. That actually means a great deal to me, and to both of us, I'm sure. So I think we should just kick it off with some thoughts of the last 8 years. You know, I was kind of basically walking through you know, this legacy of the Obama administration and trying to put into perspective exactly what we're saying goodbye to, and it's interesting to me that when I was looking at other people's reflections, you know, all the think pieces that are out there already, that people were almost universally conflicted. So I'm curious, Jodi, kind of what's your top line thought of the last 8 years?
Oh gosh, you know, I think it's a little bit hard in this moment to be utterly and completely objective, because I'm feeling in this moment, you know, you go through sort of revelations about what you think given where you are in a certain moment and what you're reflecting back on. And in this moment, I'm feeling rather frustrated with the Democrats overall and frustrated with President Obama. And so I want to try as much as I can to separate that out. I think, you know, what we've had over the past 8 years is both a great deal of promise on many levels and promises unfulfilled, and then some promises fulfilled. So I think what we might have and could have expected out of 8 years of a Democratic administration, at least a couple of which were had both houses of Congress, were to have made some further gains in areas like voting rights when they had both houses of Congress, in areas like strengthening and shoring up
access to abortion care when they had both houses of Congress, and in areas where we might have seen more proactive measures of the kind we saw in the very late stages this year of executive actions and other things that were done, which I think had they been done earlier in the administration, they might have had more lasting effect because they would have been litigated, they would have been put through the system, and we might have been able to hold on to them. I think, the good side of things is obviously that we've had some important wins. We've had the passage of the ACA, which is both a really incredibly important step forward as well as a problematic program that needed to be fixed but wouldn't be fixed without the help of the second party, until and now, what I'm calling Putin's party, and I'm only being slightly facetious. We had no cooperation. We had no sense of shared agenda with the other party in this country, not to any fault of the Democrats or President Obama. So I think we have to look at what's been achieved in terms of the limits on political power and the limited use of political power. And I think those are two distinct things. So limited use of political power where it could have been, and limits on use of political power, and then some strategic, what I would call strategic mistakes or strategic problems. Let's say, for example, we got, the use of political power to get contraception covered with no copay in the ACA, which is a tremendous step forward. On the other hand, we had the HHS writing in unnecessary rules and regulations and prohibitions on abortion at the state level and insurance policy that were not mandated by law. So I think we've had a really sort of almost a push me, pull you kind of experience with this administration, one in which I think we had tremendously high hopes for a lot of forward movement, and several of them, unfortunately, were dashed by either the limits on political power or the limited use of political power.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. Erin, you want to weigh in?
Sure, yeah. It's hard to go after Jodi, but I'm delighted to try. So, a number of reflections that I have. One, I think is, I related to what Jodi said in the sense that it's hard to be objective about this, but I think it's very important that we have this conversation at this exact moment in time when we're up against a wall and we see what's coming with the Trump-Pence-Putin administration, specifically the evisceration of civil and human rights in the United States, the attacks that we know are coming on access to abortion and reproductive health care more broadly, as well as the terrifying violence that we can expect against people of color. And so I think I want to start out with that caveat that, goodness, I could cry all night wishing Obama wasn't going anywhere. That said, I think there's a number of things that I'd like to lift up from this administration. I think it's really important for us as an activist community to be thinking about. Number one, I think, thinking a lot about the posture of social movements and how that overlaps with political parties and elected officials, and reminding ourselves that no elected official is ahead of a social movement, and we should not be taking our cues from them. Looking back to the passage of the Affordable Care Act, a law that advanced so many important things, we should fight as hard as we can to retain it and retain as much of it as we can. But at the same time, the way that specifically abortion restrictions were handled during the run-up to the ACA, I think it's a movement behavior that we need to take a look at and not replicate again. I want to be very specific. I remember, back at the time of the passage of the ACA being, at the time I was working in Washington and in another organization, and, there was a huge meeting when Bart Stupak first proposed the Stupak-Pitts Amendment, which was all about eliminating access to abortion insurance coverage. And it was like one of these spitball sessions. There was so much passion. Things were flying up on the wall. I'll do this. We were all in it together. And then At the second meeting, there were already pre-printed stickers, and it said "Pass Healthcare Reform, period, Stop Soup PAC, period." And I will never forget looking at that sticker and saying in my own mind, at exactly that moment, we just lost. And the reason why, and I think this is something that, you know, very important for activists to think about the next time that we have a more favorable legislative environment, that what we should not do is put reproductive health care second to something else. And, you know, particularly if you're going to be an advocate for reproductive health care, then advocate for reproductive health care. And we need to do that and be bold. And that's okay. And I think we've seen a lot of great behavior within our movement since then, particularly efforts led by groups like All Above All and reproductive justice organizations, and also a number of grassroots activists making abortion funding a real conversation that culminated in, you know, the Democratic Party platform this most recent election cycle, including an explicit repeal of Hyde, or goal of explicit repeal of Hyde, and the most pro-abortion stance that we've ever heard out of a major party nominee in history. And I also want to acknowledge that Bernie had very similar positions. So I think, you know, going back to Obama, it's really important to think about pressure and keeping pressure on people who we consider to be, or who many people would say call friends, right? You know, we even saw most recently with the Obama administration, there was a United States of Women Summit that was held in, I believe it was May, and reproductive rights were just left off the agenda entirely. Reproaction placed a full-page ad in the Washington Post the day of the summit, and also in partnership with groups at the Center for Health and Gender Equity and Amnesty International USA. We had people outside as summit volunteers or summit attendees were going in talking about President Obama's still failure to take executive action on Helms, which would allow for abortion funding in cases of rape, incest, and life endangerment and foreign assistance. This is like, you know, a very easy lift. It's a stroke of a pen. He's been well aware for 8 years, hasn't done it. So I think that's, and, you know, as a result, I would argue that as a result of that, there was actually a tiny bit of movement in the fact that the Obama administration actually spoke with reporters and said they weren't going to do anything about it, at least for the moment. We can hope that something will still happen. Anyway, that's a lot to say, and I'd love to hear your take, Pamela, because, you know, I think another piece is, you know, we had this Democratic power in the White House, and even for a time period we had Democratic power in both the House and the Senate, and it seemed like a lot of the focus was off the states, and look what happened. So I'd love to hear you say more too.
Yeah. So I have thoughts and opinions. So I can't approach the Obama presidency as anything other than what I am, which is a Black woman who is doing this work and has been doing this work for over a decade in St. Louis, Missouri, which is has definitely experienced both some unbelievable activism, but also unbelievable oppression, both on abortion rights, and then, as we know, as they intersect on racial justice and just basic civil rights. And so when I think about it, it is with a very, I get very emotional about the last 8 years, because for me, this was such, the election of a Black person to the presidency in the United States of America was so far-fetched that my father used to use it as a reference point when telling us we weren't going to get toys around Christmas, like when a Black man becomes president. And I remember, that was just how unbelievable it was. And I remember election night, and having worked on that campaign at the time. I worked for Planned Parenthood Advocates in Missouri, and worked really, really hard, and still had that realism that this probably wouldn't happen because this is America. And as the election results started coming in, I actually was at a bar with a bunch of other progressive friends, and I left and I went home to be with my sister, and we watched the announcement that Barack Obama had been elected president in absolute silence in my home. Um, I was just incapable of speech. With people who know me knows that's very rare, but it was huge. And so there was such great hope and promise, which often is on the shoulders of Black people who reach positions of power. And there was also, I think, um, throughout the campaign, and then even more so during the presidency, these great expectations, but also, um, the reality that this was a president who was going to be navigating power and authority through waves and waves of white supremacy, that he was holding an office that had been held by slave owners, that had been held by overt racists, that had been held by people who slept well at night despite the violence and oppression that was meted out against people of color, held by people who perpetrated genocide against Native people, and who, willfully in real time, having heard a lot of pushback, decided that they thought, it would be acceptable to intern Japanese Americans. So that there was all of that going into, Barack Obama taking on the presidency. So I've watched this entire 8 years with incredible joy and incredible pain. Um, I am a St. Louis native, so my city and my region have really felt the brunt um, of the lack of good policy and enforceable policy to protect the basic human rights of people of color and Black people specifically, and then also the lack of some sort of enthusiasm to protect the rights and dignity of people who are living in states that won't do that for them. And so when I look at the last 8 years in Missouri and how many abortion restrictions have been passed and how many battles have been fought on campuses, in the street, 2 blocks up from my house, when I look at how many people have laid their bodies on the line and looking with desperation and hope towards an administration that they felt would have some sort of empathy, and feeling that things fell short, it makes my heart very heavy. So it's hard to process this um, in any way that doesn't feel like this is a member of my family who is not perfect, but whose imperfections have profound impacts on people's lives. And then when I think about the whole issue of when Democrats hold power, I think about that through the prism of, being in a state where we don't, and anymore, and kind of the disappointment and frustration and rage that I felt towards, a Democratic governor in the state of Missouri who, seemed to be, for lack of a better word, uninspired, and on a bad day, complicit in day-to-day oppressions. So it's interesting to me that on a federal level, there's this Democratic brand that we hold so much hope and put a lot of expectations into. In the red states, in the middle, that brand has been shot to hell, really, because we've had overt racists run as Democrats in Missouri, and hold power as Democrats in Missouri, and do horrible things. And then when we think about when Democrats hold power in many states, they hold that power having struck these deals with, you know, in which they've already set aside their morals or set aside the Democratic brand. So having come from an advertising background, it's almost like false advertising that you have this, you know, almost FDR-esque, which, you know, he wasn't the best human being, but you have this really, really well-branded party that doesn't hold, you know, its members to a basic standard federally, and then certainly falls short of that on the state-by-state basis. And yet you have people like me and my sisters in the movement who, as Black women, vote out of both a historic alignment, but also just out of, you know, a calculated risk that we are hoping that our activism will apply the proper amount of pressure to make these Democrats live up to a platform that they should be excited and enthusiastic about, but that we know that they won't be out of the goodness of their heart or out of their conviction or their loyalty to the party platform, that we are constantly confronted with politicians who are who are doing political math rather than doing the right thing. And time and time again, it is Black women, poor people, people of color who become the collateral damage. And I don't have to go more than a block up from my house to see exactly what that collateral damage looks like. So those are my thoughts.
Yeah, no, I mean, I totally hear you. I don't know what the process is about talking, but
Go ahead.
But I was just thinking, you know, when you guys were talking, you know, I've been on the side of being an advocate and running and lobbying and running an advocacy organization, and now I'm on the side of being media, and I see like parallels in what we're talking about on both sides where the problems lie. The problems lie in groups of power centers of people who, for the sake of their own access to that power center or their own power centers, you know, kind of remain and kowtow to the power center in their bubble. So reporters report on stuff within the Beltway, and they report on things that in ways that enable them to maintain access to people without really getting at the truth and without really doing their job as journalists. And to some extent, the reproductive rights movement, and I'm not talking about the justice movement, I'm talking about the rights, you know, the older, longer held pieces of the movement, to some extent, they operate in the same way. They don't do things that would be best for the actual people that we're representing because they're holding on to the power center and they're not wanting to upset that apple cart, and they want access over results. And so, or the results for them are different than what people really need. And so I think, and I think that this also then comes down to the problems with the Democratic Party writ large that have been analyzed ad nauseum since election day, but which really do need to be analyzed, which is that, you know, we pay attention in presidential elections, but we don't pay much attention to building state parties and building state parties that are based on principles, like you said, Pamela, that enable and empower people to get what they need and do what they need and hold their officials accountable. And we cross over to these, you know, racist, anti-choice people that are not representing what we need, or who they're not good people. I mean, they're not okay. And you know, we end up with sort of, again, adherence to both the power center and to the party rather than the people that the party is supposed to serve. And I think that those structural issues are issues and lessons that we need to take forward, both in, if we really want to have a democracy in the fullest sense of the word and ensure that people have, you know, health care, have their basic needs met, have opportunities to earn income, have good education, all the things I think we all stand for, then we have to really be willing to upend the apple cart that we have and build a different one, because The one we have is not bringing the apples. I mean, it's just not doing the job. And I think we really need to look at that structure.
Yeah, yeah. So just one reflection, and then I'll hand it over to Aaron. But one thing, when I was thinking about tonight's topic, I couldn't stop thinking about the amazing work that SisterSong did in 2010 and 2011 in Georgia. And as an example of what we as reproductive justice activists can do when Democrats have some power, not tremendous power, but have a voice, and also to be defiant in the face of conservative or anti-power. And I'm speaking specifically to the absolutely amazing work that they did against the racist billboard campaign and the legislation that followed. I thought that SisterSong it's like a case study in how to educate the public, how to stand up and stand up with fierce conviction against a racist narrative and own it, and particularly as a Black woman, I was incredibly inspired by it, and indeed, I was able to go down to Georgia for the founding of Trust Black Women, where we learned, because that's the work that SisterSong does so well, where they educated other RJ activists on exactly what happened, exactly how they organized, and specifically speaking to how to identify pro-abortion politicians and pro-racial justice politicians and get them connected and on the same page, and then
Right.
basically telling them, stand up, find your spine, and do this work. And so when you think about the political makeup of Georgia and the racial dynamics that are in play, it was really quite stunning to watch them beat back not just the billboards, but the legislation, and then sharing that knowledge. So I think within this 8-year time frame, we do have these examples of incredibly good work. The problem I see is that often, people within the mainstream of the left tend to freak out a little bit at that kind of that fierce conviction, and so that was like a taste of it, and then we've gotten more than our fair share of a helping of it, particularly when we look at the pushback. I know that was just viciously beaten back during the Affordable Care fight, and then even more recently and closer to home for me is just the very visible frustration that I saw from the left over Black Lives Matter, and the kind of basic demands for a day one agenda, and then post-election critiques as if somehow, talking about racial justice and talking about reproductive justice is responsible for, this electoral chaos that we currently see. So it's interesting to me that we all have, we have these wonderful examples, and that's just one. I know there's more, that we have these awesome examples of how to have a full-throated voice, speaking to both the left and the right when it comes to championing these values, and that we can see, Democrats, when they are confronted aggressively and consistently with numbers, will kind of bend to do the right thing. It's unfortunate that that's what it takes so often, but it's particularly unfortunate that there seems to be so much opposition to even doing that, as if, well, now's not the time, or we need to be cautious. So I'm curious for y'all's thoughts on that, and I'll kick it over to Aaron to weigh in.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly it would be a huge mistake to respond to the current election results with an idea that we need to be cautious in terms of our demands, right? And I think, I want to touch on what you just spoke about, Pamela, in particular, this idea that somehow principled activism was somehow responsible for the chaos that was just thrust on the country in the form of an election result fueled and enabled by Russian interference in the case where Hillary Clinton clearly won the popular vote by more than 2 million and got the most votes of any candidate in history. So, I mean, I think there's a lot to unpack there. But I think, looking forward and reflecting back on what just happened, one thing that I hope that we do not lose as a movement in this new environment, where now we no longer just simply have red states, we have a red nation, right? The entire United States is now a red nation and is living in the reality of the red states. And for that, we can be grateful that there are so many strong reproductive justice organizations led by women of color in states around the country that have really showed a path forward, just like the Billboard campaign that you referenced, Pamela, for what we can do in this new environment in which we find ourselves nationally. Another piece that I'd actually love to bring up that's it's actually a different question, but I feel it's very important to be talked about because I think it actually came up in the last election cycle, and I want to make sure that we do everything we can to make sure this never happens again. And that is, it's impossible to have a conversation about what happened with regards to reproductive health rights and justice from the stance of the Obama administration without having a conversation about Joe Biden, and in particular Vice President Biden's views about abortion. He just within the last year did an interview and he said that he believes that abortion is always wrong. And we know that Vice President Biden was consistently working with the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, inviting them into the White House for meetings. And I think that when you look back in hindsight, I think that we need to be frank and honest about the tremendous amount of damage that a Democrat who says that they are personally pro-life but, will stand up for Roe v. Wade, what they can do when they're in positions of power. And specifically, I mean, I think in my mind, a number of things where the Obama administration didn't have the boldness that activists had been hoping for on reproductive health rights and justice, whether it's the endless rounds of compromises, proactive compromises offered to the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops on the birth control benefit, which was just an exercise in futility, right? There were always going to be more lawsuits, right? They were never going to be satisfied. They want the whole law to tank. But also, things like the Obama administration in their statement, even after the Whole Woman's Health decision came out in June, the biggest abortion access case in a generation, certainly in my lifetime. And, the word abortion wasn't even used in the recognition of the case, right? And so I think that it's really important, and I want to lift it up also because it came out even in the last election cycle. Activists had right to be frustrated and feel a sense of betrayal when Hillary Clinton brought Tim Kaine on as her running mate, particularly when the mainstream reproductive rights organizations, particularly I'm talking about Planned Parenthood, NARAL, and also Emily's List, had endorsed her very early and invested significant ground game in her campaign during a hotly contested primary. And then she turns around and picks someone who, said that he was personally pro-life. He actually went around and contradicted her about her stance on the Hyde Amendment. And that came out in public, which is pretty unusual in the context of a presidential campaign.
Erin, are you still there?
Yeah, can you hear me? Hello?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Whoops.
Pamela, can you hear me?
Pamela, can you hear me?
Pamela, can you hear us? Okay.
Well, it says
Jodi,
something about muted on the thing. Maybe she's accidentally muted.
okay, let me see if she is
Or maybe
muted. Oh, let's see here. Looks like she's offline. All right, well, looks like it's paused. Let's see what's going on here. Showing the main screen. It's recording. We can hear each other.
Sorry about that. I think I'm back on. I think we lost connection.
Oh, great.
Okay, good.
Okay, good. All right. I think we're going. So I'll just wrap it up and close then. But what I've been saying was, you know, we actually had the groundwork laid, it appeared, at a certain point in the last presidential election campaign cycle for what happened with Joe Biden and the Obama administration to happen all over again with Tim Kaine and the Hillary Clinton administration, something that seemed all the more heartbreaking because she had put forward this incredibly bold platform on abortion, you know, the first major party candidate ever to call for the repeal of Hyde. She flanked out to the left of Obama. I want to acknowledge that's not where she was naturally. That happened because activists demanded it of her. And, you know, fortunately, by the time of the vice presidential debate, it seemed like Tim Kaine had figured it out. He was asked a question and he pivoted away from getting lost in his feelings and contradicting Hillary Clinton, but rather saying, you know, turning the tables on Mike Pence, why don't you trust women, which is exactly where it should be. The focus should be on public policy and the focus should be on holding the opposition accountable. But I do think, you know, it's impossible to look back on the Obama administration in particular and its stance toward reproductive rights and health without acknowledging that, you know, the number 2 person in that administration had, I'll be generous and call it mixed feelings about reproductive rights. And that's something that's a serious problem within the left that needs to be addressed in an ongoing basis.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's a quite bigger problem even because you see, for example, Biden now just, you know, sort of coddling, you know, saying what a great guy Pence is and what a great guy Sessions is and what a great guy this guy is. And, you know, it's kind of like enough already. They're not great guys. They seek to take away the rights of many, many, many people. They're a threat to public health. They're a threat to civil rights. They're not great guys. And it's kind of like, you know, white men praising white men. I'm done.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one of the things, just to jump in here, that I find interesting is when we think about, like, when Democrats hold power, that they still carry with them this you know, their privilege in very many ways, and then also this kind of really skewed lens of reality that I really do think, you know, we need to debunk, and now that we're faced with a different political landscape, the battle becomes, you know, even stronger, because I'm just thinking specifically about how almost immediately after the election, everybody started talking about how we don't need to do identity politics, and I saw a little bit, not as much, but a little bit of this conversation about, you know, talking about abortion or talking about racial justice, talking about, you know, police violence and state violence against people of color was a problem that alienated, you know, the folks that we really need to be speaking to, which is working class white men, working class straight white men. So what I found really fascinating about it is that's not a new line, not a new script for those of us who are doing work in red states. So, you know, as a Missourian, that's old music. So, you know, I've heard it for years. And well, you know, abortion is a wedge issue, or, you know, we don't want to talk about racial justice because then Democrats are going to never win outstate in Missouri. And so in reality, it's just like something that there's some inner work that we keep avoiding, that my concern now is that the lesson that we take away from this needs to be that we need to do this inner work now, even though we are faced with this really terrifying regime. We still need to go ahead and have a confrontation about why we talk about why we accept the perpetuation of abortion stigma in democratic policies, why we back away from, conversations about racial justice, even though the most loyal, consistent voting bloc within the Democratic Party has been Black women. Why, with this emerging, beautiful, multicultural majority, are we now going to suddenly figure out how we can appeal to folks who, for in large part in Missouri, have not necessarily demonstrated that they're off the mark, and by that I mean specifically that Democrats do a really poor job of explaining why they should win, and one of the reasons why they should win would be, if they did, that they are championing something that's incredibly popular and incredibly well accepted, which is access to abortion and indeed access to the full spectrum of reproductive rights. And so when I kind of see what Democrats do when they're in power, and it's even worse when they're in a minority, but it's pretty bad when they're in power, then I'm just confronted with this frustration that I've had for well over a decade, that basically running as Democrat light, or basically making excuses for these policies does not work, and particularly when the opposition is going to brand you as pro-abortion, they're going to brand you as pro-immigration, so you might as well be that. But what I see is that when in power, there's a tendency to say, well, but that's a controversial issue, and kind of double down on the stigma that people have associated with abortion rights, and then with many of the intersectional oppressions that we work on. So I'm curious, like, when we think about when Democrats are in power, and what lessons can we learn? I think the first lesson that I think of is that not standing up for your convictions and not standing for something is a losing game plan, and that when you do stand for something, you win. And more importantly, for those people doing work in red states, that even if you lose, at least you've had the opportunity to educate people about the issues, so that you can build a foundation to actually get to future wins, as opposed to the stuff I see now in Missouri, and I'm sure in other states. I certainly have looked at our neighboring states, which is that you're going to lose, and you're going to walk around basically campaigning like a Republican who likes the color blue, and then turn around and wonder why nobody seems to be excited about core democratic principles.
Where do you feel that comes from, Pamela? Like you're saying, the message, because I agree with both of you entirely, that there's not only no reason that we shouldn't be talking about justice right now and abortion rights and everything that we believe in, but rather we must be. And so, like, where do you feel you're being, from which angle you feel you're being told to be quiet? It's the formal party?
Yeah, well, I'm not going to say that the formal party has said, you need to shut up now, but definitely just, in political circles, that's been a very clear message. And in some situations, I think it has been like now's not the time. But I definitely think, in the past, that there just has not been, there's been this climate of kind of trying to tamp down on the many core principles of, of equality and and healthcare access that used to be just the basic foundation. And even though Democrats in the past, I'm not trying to say that Democrats in the past did a great job with this. They certainly didn't necessarily meet those marks, but they were at least trying to espouse them. At least they were preaching from that playbook, and then on policy falling short. And so when I think about like what the motivation is for that, I go back to the political calculus. I think the overarching issue is that you have unaddressed white supremacy, and that's kind of the giant elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about. So politicians are people, and people who work in political spaces are people, and they carry with them all of these oppressions and isms that they haven't dismantled. So I think that is probably the bigger overarching issue. And then when you get right down to it, we have created an environment where it's about when, and in many situations, the quest to victory has created a scenario in which we've seen some of our politicians become that which they would they campaigned against. So it's like win, and you're going to make some bizarre political calculus that it's important not to talk about these issues, even though the only reason there's any political benefit in not talking about these issues is that you don't talk about them. Because when we do talk about abortion rights, when we do talk about immigration, when we talk about racial justice, when we talk about state violence, and all of those issues, when we do talk about them, people are moved. It's the fact that what we're lacking is not even, I don't want to use the word courage, but like some spine. And it's particularly alarming when Democrats are in power, because that's when you would expect them to have that spine, and yet I still haven't seen it.
So this is Erin, and I want to insert one note of positivity into it, not to gloss over all of the very real problems that have been outlined. And in particular, I want to underscore the very real problem of white supremacy within the Democratic Party and the left that needs to be addressed, and it's a gaping wound, and until it is addressed, we're not going anywhere. But I also want to, because I know that we're coming up on time for this portion and we need to close, I want to talk a bit about, actually, as you were speaking, I was thinking, we should remind ourselves that nobody is perfect, and no politician is going to be perfect. We should not expect it from them. But I also, as someone who grew up in Minnesota and who actually, started doing campaign work. Actually, it wasn't the first campaign work. The first one was when I was 11. It would have been our first woman senator. She didn't win. But for Paul Wellstone, the late Senator Paul Wellstone, who wasn't perfect on every vote, but was an incredibly principled man, and you knew what he stood for. And he would, frequently thump his chest and say, I represent the Democratic wing of the Democratic Party. And he actually ran a campaign against Rudy Boschwitz, throwing back the insults against him for taking principled stands, embarrassingly liberal. He had a green bus, and he went around the state, and he specifically had a very strong economic justice message. And so the fact is, a funny little short guy, he won, and he won multiple times, and he was a stalwart, staunch progressive vote in many, many areas, not all, but in many, and people respond to conscience, and I think that's something that we can remind our elected officials, that people want bold vision, and that's something that they get excited about and believe in. So if it's okay with y'all, I'm going to move it to just plug our Reproaction campaigns and encourage everyone to get involved. We encourage everyone to sign up for email alerts at www.reproaction.org. That way you won't miss a thing. I did throw on there, check out our Bad Legacy campaign on the Helms Amendment, specifically because there's a closing window here for President Obama to act for women who have been raped in conflict overseas. Also, check out the awesome Show Me RJ accountability campaign in Missouri. It's at www.showmerj.org. And you can follow us on social media. We're Reproaction on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And I also want to encourage everyone here to save the date for our next Reproaction Act and Learn webinar. Our topic next month, it's going to be right before inauguration. It's All the President's Men Understanding Donald Trump's Anti-Abortion Clique. We will focus not just on the anti-choice views and track records. It's truly frightening, sneak preview, but also their entire anti-civil rights, anti-human rights, racist, xenophobic, pro-corporate agenda. So we'll dig deep in, save the date. And with that, I'll pass it back to Pamela.
Thank you very much, Erin. So usually at this time, we'll take questions. And for folks who are attending, if you want to drop your question into the question tab, which should be on your GoToWebinar control panel, that'd be great. While we wait for those to come in, or if any do come in, I'd just like some thoughts on, from Jodi and then from Erin. What, if anything, if you can put a finger on it, would you have liked to see in the last 8 years? Like what piece of legislation or policy or change would you have liked to see, and then kind of what do you think we can do with it going forward? Don't jump in all at once.
Okay, no, I didn't want to jump in because I didn't know if it was who you wanted to go first. But I guess I'll just say, I mean, if you're asking for legislation I would have liked to have seen, and not talk about legislation I thought went bad, I would really love to have seen a full-on, full-court press around the Voting Rights Act, because I don't believe we can have reproductive justice, economic justice, or any kind of justice unless people have the right to vote and be active in politics. And so much stems from people's access to the ballot box and their ability to have confidence in the fact that they are participating. I mean, a long while ago, I wrote a piece, you can't vote for people that hear you. And so I just think that is one extraordinarily missed opportunity that has been problematic ever since and will continue to be problematic. And I'd like to see us not stop talking about it along with all the other issues we've talked about tonight, because I think it has to be talked about. It has to be public, the suppression of the vote and the continuing narrowing of our electorate.
Yeah, that's a big one. Definitely. I share your emotion with that of all the things that most troubled me in the last 8 years, it's really been like the steady erosion and attacks, and kind of what I saw is these tests that were dropped across the country, like testing out different policies that would suppress votes, and kind of seeing what worked and what wouldn't be challenged in the courts. And then when they found the perfect recipe, they just went for it. And then I remember when we saw, basically the core body of the Voting Rights Act gutted, it just broke my heart. It was just so hard, in large part because both of my parents worked on voting rights in their 20s, and so I was raised in a family that was very proud of the achievement of that, and indeed raised in a family where several of my relatives were not able to vote until 1968, when everything finally got reconciled. So it's incredibly alarming, to kind of see that kind of erosion, and then not see people kind of all up in arms. I want to point out though that I was, just absolutely blown away and inspired by the work that is going on in North Carolina, and just incredible organizing around the issue, and then around just a full intersectional menu of issues, but really super zeroing in on the impact that voter suppression was having on people's lives and on their ability to determine who decides policy. So even in the midst of incredible attacks on voting rights, we've seen a lot of great activism kick in that has been incredibly inspiring, and hopefully will set the tone for the battles yet to come. Erin, did you have a piece of legislation or policy that you had hoped for?
Well, briefly, I will say that I wish that we would have had, that the last Supreme Court nominee would have been an open progressive. I would have loved to have seen Loretta Lynch nominated for the Supreme Court. I would have, and I also want to say and acknowledge that, the Obama administration did put forward tremendous effort, right, on a number of fronts. I really wish the Obama administration's efforts on guns would have yielded fruit. And I think it's a moral abomination that the Republicans blocked everything. Even right after Newtown, today is the 4-year anniversary of the massacre at the Newtown Elementary School. And it's chilling. And I know, having watched the president, that it's one of the areas where he gets most emotional and things he gets most upset about during his presidency. And I also want to acknowledge all of the good work that President Obama did try to do and how stymied he was.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we do have a question here from Padma about strategies for solidarity building, and the Padma says that was frustrated, like all of us, about the public opinion that the lesson from this election is that working class white men have been neglected more than working class people of color, but does see a space for solidarity with working class women and queer communities around reproductive justice as a kind of intersection of interests. So what do y'all think would be some strategies for dismantling those class-based interests from white supremacy in a way that would help build a movement for reproductive justice? That's a great question. Who wants to weigh in first?
I can go fast.
Go fast.
I can go fast because I know we're right up at time and I want to give Jodi a chance to talk. But I would say we need to push back very strenuously against this narrative of the, quote, white working class as this monolithic entity, and not an acknowledgement of the tremendous amount of people of color who are part of the working class.
Thank you. Jodi?
Well, I totally agree with what Erin just said, and I think, this sounds very trite, but I think organizing in your neighborhood, your community, and your state, we've got to start building our power at the state level. Join with other people who are doing that. Create your own networks and get out there and make that stream into a river. I think we need to be doing that in every state.
Here, here, and yes, absolutely. And also, you know, to kind of lean into the those conversations, I think that that was a beautifully constructed question that can serve as a foundation for discussions going forward. So I plan to rip it off a little bit. I think that's a great question to start conversations in the kind of conversations that we need to have. So thank you for it. Um, so, so thank you for that. And we are at time, and we pride ourselves on being very prompt. So I want to thank Jodi Jacobson for joining us for this call. I want to thank all of our attendees for joining us. And so thank you very much. We will be tweeting out a recording of this within the next 24 hours, usually. And so with that, I'll say good night, and thank you, Erin, as always.
Thank you, Pamela.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.